There we go. All right. So we're so excited to do our second session of our 2021 Volunteer Engagement Leadership Series. Thrilled to have Sue Carter-Kale with us. I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. We had a fantastic session last week. We will be posting that recording at volunteerflorida.org/VELS, which is our homepage for the series. We'll have the PowerPoint as well, and we're going to also be posting Sue's materials as well. So I'm excited to have that available for you all to have a look again. This is going to be fantastic information. You can pass on to your colleagues, individuals who weren't able to participate today. So just real quickly, I know many of you are familiar with our organization, but just wanted to give you a quick reminder of what we do and who we are as Volunteer Florida. So we're the lead agency for volunteerism and national service in Florida. Sue's very familiar. She's been a state service commissioner before. So there are 52 of us. We're in every state and a couple of territories. And we are established in order to stream certain types of funding for national service at the federal level. Here in Florida, we also are the lead agency for volunteers and donations before, during, and after disasters. And then we also generally foster volunteerism. We very much want to see Floridians who are engaged, communities that are transformed, and ultimately Florida being a better place to live. And you all are such a critical component to that. Everything that you all do in your organizations, from engaging volunteers, all of the ways that you all serve your communities. We stand in solidarity with you and love to be able to provide you all with the support that you need to do that really great work. So specifically for volunteer services, which is the department that I head up, I work very much focused on training and resources, relationship building, Volunteer Connect, which is our volunteer opportunities platform. I'll be sending you all some information about that. It's a way for you to post and manage volunteer opportunities so that Floridians who have an interest and who are browsing the site know the ways that they can serve their communities. So hoping that all of you register your organizations for that platform that we're really proud to be able to provide for you all. And again, our focus is engaging Floridians. We want people to be serving, to have that civic ownership of where they live. So you all have received an email from me. You received one this morning with Sue's handouts, but volunteer at volunteerflorida.org. Anytime you have questions, anytime you have anything you want to troubleshoot or you'd like to learn more about our grants and information, please feel free to email me or to browse our website, volunteerflorida.org. So just a reminder, you all have seen on our website when you registered next week, we have a wonderful opportunity to talk to a couple of really extraordinary executives, really interesting and helpful information I think you all will see and be encouraged by. So I hope you'll join us next Monday. And then 2 weeks from today, really thrilled to have a wonderful individual who's going to be sharing with us unique competencies and professional ethics for leaders of volunteers. Really encourage you all to attend both of those. And also, I just want to say good morning to everyone who is saying good morning in the chat. I love when people do that. Makes me really happy on a Monday morning. So thank you to all of you. I see some of our grantees, some other individuals that we partner with, some new folks. So we're so glad to have you. All right, so today, purpose-driven volunteer impact. Sue's going to get into this in just a minute. Sue Carter-Kale, president of Sue Carter-Kale Consulting, is going to be sharing with us today. She has tremendous experience in a number of fields, all just so relevant to the work that she does. She's a very frequent and very insightful speaker and trainer. Many of us have participated in her trainings at various conferences over the years, and always just really blown away by the information that she's able to share with us. I encourage you all to go to volunteercommons.com. She'll probably share a little bit more with you about that, but she shares great insights there for those of us who engage volunteers. And she has a PhD in leadership from the University of San Diego and focused in there in terms of her dissertation on volunteer engagement in a number of different ways. So I am going to turn it over to Sue. We're going to switch our screens here.
All right, and I will.
She's going to go ahead and get started there. So Sue, welcome. Volunteer Florida is thrilled to have you, and we will go ahead and have you get started and roll for the next hour and 15 or so.
Thank you. I am very glad to be here today. I'm just going to pull up my screen real quick and make sure that we can all see the same thing. All right. And then can you see that okay, Javita?
Perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for helping me be here today so I could participate in this series. You've got a lot of great speakers, and it's an honor to be part of this. And it's an honor to get to spend some time with you this morning talking about really one of my very favorite things, which is the contributions that volunteers make to their agencies. And let me make sure. Okay, so a little bit more context about my background and why this is one of my favorite topics. I've spent my entire career working with nonprofits in a variety of roles. And the thread that has really connected them over that time, which I wasn't necessarily purposeful in, but has turned out to really be the connective tissue, has been volunteerism. And sometimes that's been in a very direct role, such as when I ran a volunteer center or helped coordinate volunteers as a volunteer for our local Girl Scout Council. And other times it's been woven in more subtle ways when I was doing fundraising or public relations or other types of roles in program. And one of the things that I've noticed along that time is that there's a gap between how we talk about volunteerism and how we resource it. We often say glowing things about how volunteers are the heart of our organization and we can't do what we do without volunteers, which is often true. And at the same time, behind closed doors, there's kind of this conversation sometimes amongst paid staff about whether volunteers are worth that trouble. And so one of the things that I was really curious about is why does that gap exist? And it was one of the things that led me back to graduate school, was to spend more time looking at that. And one of the things that I thought that I was going to do was identify a lot of different ways that we could talk about volunteer value and then organize them and put them in nice little bundles with a bow on top so that I could support practitioners in the field in making the case for volunteerism. The problem was that the data didn't agree with that. And so that was a bit of a sticky point for me as I was doing the research. But what happened was that it led to deeper insights that we'll be talking about today, actually. So a little roadmap about where we're going to go. I'm going to talk about the distinction between value and value proposition that will lead us to a model that helps us support a more purpose-driven approach to volunteer impact, and then finish up with some tactical ways about how we can capture volunteer impact. And thanks so much for everyone introducing yourself in the chat. I'm going to try to keep an eye on that as we go, and just if you're having questions, I'll stop at a couple points for those, but please feel free to add a question to the chat at any time. As far as my philosophy goes with workshops, I like to think of them more as learning labs or play shops, where this is a chance to kind of put the ideas under the microscope and see if they're still working for us, maybe challenge assumptions, question how things are going. I also believe that we all have something to teach and we all have something to learn, and today the chat will be one of the places that we do that. Sometimes I'll ask you questions and encourage you to participate in that chat. That really helps this be a little bit more interactive, so I can use what your experiences are along the way. And then finally, we all know volunteerism is an enormously diverse activity across organizations. And so it's really hard, if not impossible, actually, to come up with a solution for every single organization that's participating today. I think we're around 71 folks here so far. And so I can't give you all of the answers, but what I'll try to do is introduce some questions and some content that you can really apply to your own organization. So the worksheets will support that effort today, but just wanted to give you a little bit of sense about where we'll be going. So this is the first chance to get involved and share your experience. And I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Think about a time that you volunteered, and would you share what was meaningful about that service to you? So as a volunteer, what was something that was meaningful to you about your service? And then I will read a few of these out loud as you're populating there.
And Sue, I will monitor the Q&A in the chat as well for you.
Awesome, thank you very much. Thank you, Darlene Gold Star, for starting us off. Feeling that like you were making a difference, feeling useful, hearing student and family stories, seeing the impact firsthand. Thanks, Jordan. These are coming in a little wild and woolly already, so this is great. Love this. Candace said, having a direct impact and knowing I actually made a difference. It's really powerful to see that firsthand, isn't it? Molly talks about being part of a community of volunteers and shared that working as part of a team to help people recover from a natural disaster. Right? I mean, that's an incredible piece, not only to be seeing the impact, but be part of a team for that, especially when folks are at some of their greatest need. Meals of Hope with the Girl Scout troop, the number of meals we were able to make. Great. Making a difference to wildlife conservation, knowing I was filling a need. So you can see some real themes here, helping or hearing back from the students that I helped out with, right? That really closes the loop for us. Being recognized and appreciated by the organization, making an impact, and that a sense of appreciation for being there too. Melanie talks about it was something I love to do anyway, so it was great to have an impact on others. So feel free to keep those going. Wow, this Florida, you get all kinds of gold stars. This is the best participation I've seen in a chat in a long time, so I appreciate that. And I hope you'll have a chance to be scrolling through those as you go. But you might notice that no one has said so far that I've seen that the most important thing, the most meaningful thing about their service was that they served 243 hours, right? So this is a little sample about what mattered to us as volunteers. We can also think about the impact that volunteers are making on the organization. We know, for example, that they're bringing in labor, but it's an incredible source not only of talent, but also passion and energy that come in with those volunteers. We know, for example, from research that volunteers give more financially than non-volunteers, and oftentimes they're giving where they serve. Volunteers often can be some of our very best advocates and ambassadors for the organization, getting the word out. So many of us feel like the best kept secret in our communities, and volunteers are helping let that secret out of the bag. And when volunteers are having a good experience, they also lead to a sense of trust and transparency. As many of you talked about, getting to see that impact firsthand. I mean, there's nothing quite so powerful. You can't read that in an appeal letter. You can't hear about that necessarily in a different way. And what's interesting, I think, about all of these things is as nonprofits or as government agencies, we need all of these things to be successful. And particularly that trust piece. It's not like you can go to the trust store and buy that off the shelf. That comes from relationships. And volunteering is one of the most potent relationships that can build that sense of trust. So thank you so much for sharing these. So you can see just in our initial examples on our own, as well as a recap of what volunteers are doing for organizations, it's a pretty dynamic thing. And yet what we do so often is reduce that complex and beautiful and messy kind of experience of volunteering down to the number of volunteers and their hours and an hourly financial rate, sometimes like the one from independent sector that they put out every year. And I think we've been laboring under this belief that if we just had enough of the right quantitative data, that it would lead to support. And by support, I mean, sometimes that means money, sometimes that means participation from the rest of the organization. And that can be really powerful. And yet so often that hasn't been the case. You know, people smile and they nod and they say that's amazing, and then they go right back to kind of business as usual. And so one of the things that I wanted to do is really figure out what's behind all that. How come we are doing exactly what we've been told in terms of collecting all of these numbers, the industry standards? Why is it that that's not really leading to the kind of support that we need in the organization? So one of the first clues that I found about that was in terms of value and value proposition. Now, value is the price that we assign a good or a product or a service. So we can think about that in terms of price. But marketers know that all products and services also have a value proposition. And the value proposition is our subjective perception of that product or service. And that influences our willingness to pursue or buy that. So if we think about that in really tactical terms, we can think about a cup of coffee. Now, if you're a coffee drinker, you could go to 7-Eleven and get a cup of coffee for a fairly reasonable price. But we know that lots of folks are going to Starbucks to get that same kind of cup of coffee, even though it's more expensive. Now, what happens here is if we were just looking on paper, the value would favor the 7-Eleven. But given the fact that there's 3 Starbucks within walking distance of my house, says that the value proposition is drawing an awful lot of folks there. So maybe it's that it feels like a treat or an indulgence. Maybe it's because the barista knows my name. Maybe it's because I just love the smell in the morning and that helps me feel like it's getting me launched into today. Whatever it is, that value proposition, my subjective experience of Starbucks that makes me go buy that, even though it costs more, is what's influencing my behavior. So if we were going to apply that to volunteers, we could start out and saying, well, we know that independent sector puts a financial price tag on the value of a volunteer. So the national rate this year is $28.54. And we often will multiply that out by the number of volunteers we have, of course, to say volunteers made a financial contribution or to our organization of $650,000 based on volunteer time. And again, sometimes that's leading people to go, wow. And then they just sort of glaze over and keep going. And I think one of the reasons is because the value proposition of volunteering is a different sort of thing. People are asking, well, what's in it for me to work with volunteers? What's in it for the organization? Are they going to help our mission? So if I go to one of my colleagues, for example, who might be in program, she's thinking about, well, what's the quality of the work? Is the volunteer going to be able to do a good job for me? Will they keep showing up? Do they have the skills and qualifications they need to be successful? If I'm trying to get my executive director or a senior leadership team on board, they're thinking, well, how are volunteers contributing to the bottom line? How much time and effort is it going to take? Will it be worth our while to have volunteers involved in the organization? And if our colleagues think that the value is low, the quality will be low, and my effort will be high, then that makes them less likely to pursue. That means that volunteers will have a low value proposition. And the research tells us that it's actually value proposition driving folks more than the so-called objective data that we're giving them with the price. And so I think that might be influencing our reaction and sometimes the hesitance that we encounter in terms of talking about volunteerism. Because what that tells us then is that if our subjective experiences are driving things more than objective data, we really need to figure out what is going to meet people, what will be meaningful to people in terms of their perception. So how do we get to that point? One of the things that seems to not be working is our current cycle, which a lot of times says, well, the funder is asking for X or our board is asking for Y, perhaps volunteer hours. And so that's what we give them. And then if you're serving on a board or you're a funder, sometimes you're like, well, the things that everybody tells me are volunteer numbers and hours and a financial rate. So that's what we're going to ask for. And it sets up this loop that isn't necessarily connected to what's most meaningful to the organization. And so what came out of the research was that anything that we do with our volunteers really has to be driven by purpose. It really needs to be grounded in our mission and our values. And so this is what we'll be spending our time applying this model to your organization. So let's dig in. We're going to start out here with our true north of mission and values. And if you have the handouts available, this is where you can start jotting notes down. And it's not a huge problem if you don't. Feel free to take your notes on your computer or just pull out a piece of paper and I'll give you the prompts as we go along. So we're starting off with the true north, which is our mission. And we need to be clear about what the organization exists to do in the first place. Too often we're assessing volunteer success in one way, and we're assessing volunteer or organizational success in another way. And that makes it really easy to overlook or to write volunteers out of the budget because we haven't connected into that mission. So that's why it's important to think about that. We also want to identify the values for our organization. Now, some of us have a formal values statement that, hanging on the wall in the office, perhaps. Other folks are working off of more informal values about what matters in terms of how we do our work. Our values really kind of are a filter. What matters to us in terms of that? And for a lot of organizations, taking a closer look at how their work is or isn't equitable, those are important values to be thinking about too. Is our organization creating a sense of belonging for the people who we want to engage in all different ways? Then we can go to the bottom of the model, which is about being guided by people. Now, I specifically and intentionally use the word guided rather on purpose because we want to be thoughtful about all of the different audiences that we have who care about our work. And that could be a direct involvement that they care about it as a participant, or maybe the loved one of a participant, our staff or volunteers. But we also want to think about our funders and the external partners. And again, we want to be guided by them, but not dictated, because sometimes they have conflicting opinions about what our organization should be doing. And other times they even have an idea about what we should be doing that conflicts with the mission. So we want to hold that in mind, but not be completely dictated by it. So I will stop there for just a moment. If you do have the handouts, and it looks like they've just been posted in the chat as well. So you're welcome to pull those up there and maybe just take a couple notes in terms of what your mission is, what your values are, and a few of the audiences that care about your work. All right. And hopefully everybody's been able to pull those up. So we'll go ahead and keep going. Now, the next part is that we're going to move on to the promise. The promise part of the model is why volunteers are engaged in the organization. So it's their promise or their purpose of having volunteers at all. You can think about this also as what you hope to achieve by engaging volunteers in the organization. This is something that we rarely talk about. And as a result, we might have very different reasons on the team about why we're engaging volunteers in the work of the organization. So it's really important to spend some time thinking about that, saying it out loud explicitly, and also talking about how do we get alignment around that as well. Because since volunteering is one of the main ways that the community is engaging in our work and can be addressing some pieces of equity, it's really important to be thinking about why is it that volunteers are here, and are we delivering on that? Of course, if we want to think about what that looks like in practice, a lot of times people say, well, the reason we have volunteers is to save money, that volunteers are a low-cost form of labor. The problem is with that is that oftentimes it's not true. Many times it's not a matter of having this big pile of money over here that we were going to spend on staff, and when we get volunteers, we now can spend that money on something else. Most of the time, that big pile of money doesn't exist. And the real trade-off is we either have volunteers to help us do our work, or we don't get to do that program at all. And so the other issue is that along the lines of, if we're saying that volunteers save money, and then as the volunteer director goes with a budget, it makes it kind of confusing to folks. It's like, well, they're supposed to save us money. Why do we have to spend money on them? So another value proposition that we want to consider is that volunteers are not just a low cost form of labor, but a unique form of labor. So a lot of us, if you think about someone who is serving in a fundraising role as a volunteer, or maybe a tutor, their efforts are perceived to be a bit more authentic than those of us who might be getting paid to serve with an organization. So that there's a different value proposition, right? If I have a mentor or a coach and that person is supporting me on a volunteer basis, that sends a different kind of message than if that coach or mentor is paid. It's not that it's necessarily a bad thing. It just affects the quality of the service a little bit. But I think one of the most powerful value propositions is to borrow from the late Susan Ellis, who many of us know and have followed her work for a long time, is to say instead that volunteers help us extend the budget and volunteers help us extend the mission. So if we look at the budget we have and then we add volunteers to the mix, we can take that farther as a result. Same kind of thing when we add volunteers to our program and operation, they help us extend that mission. And that might seem like just a really semantic kind of notation, I think, to make, but it can be really, our language matters. And I think language can be really powerful here, because the way that we resource and manage something when we're scrimping and saving is very different than the way we resource and manage something when we are investing in our mission. Right. And so we want to make sure, again, that we have alignment, because if someone thinks it's just if it's just to save money, and now we say, here's the budget and here's the staffing that we need to support this, getting in alignment is really powerful there. So thank you. Yes, language matters, I think, and we'll be talking about language throughout. So if we want to think about what this looks like in practice, we'll just use a community garden, for example. So we might think about two different reasons to involve volunteers. One, of course, is to build and maintain and grow our community garden. But the other thing we might want to be really, we want to have volunteers for is as ambassadors, right? A lot of times volunteers can be the very best spokespeople for our organization. So if that's part of our goal, then let's be explicit about that and talking about one purpose of having volunteers involved in the organization. And let's not just leave that up to chance that they're ambassadors. Let's invite them in and support them in that. So that'll help us get to the next piece. If we want to take a deeper dive into volunteer promise, we can think about volunteers are bringing capacity into the organization in these different forms. And then they bring, if they've got a good experience, they bring a sense of belonging back out into the community. So I'll give you just a moment to read through these to think about volunteer promise in this way. Okay, so let's keep moving on here. I'm going to give you a moment, if you've got the worksheet held up or even just your sheet of paper, to think about what is the volunteer promise of your organization. Now, this might be really clear for you. It might be clear as day. However, if you want to be having these conversations with others to see, well, are we in alignment around why volunteers are in our organization? I'd like to give you a few questions so you can take these back to your teams to do the same kind of thing. And sometimes it can be helpful to say, if we had a huge grant or somebody just said, we're going to endow you for the next 20 years, are you still going to involve volunteers in your work? Why or why not? And if you are still going to involve volunteers, that tells you a little bit about the promise of your volunteer promise. Another question is, can your organization achieve its mission without the community? And if you can't, and I don't know any of us who can solve the big vision and mission that we have for our organization with just paid staff, then that's going to tell you volunteers are helping us bridge that gap. And thinking about how is it that having volunteers or the community involved in your organization, how does that support you? So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about this. If you've got the worksheet, this is the prompt. If you don't have the worksheet, this is the prompt. So volunteers uniquely help us meet our mission by, you can, whoops, I accidentally pushed the wrong button there. So you can think about this and take maybe a couple notes. Please feel free to plug some of those into the chat as well. What is the promise of volunteers in your organization? All right, thanks, Anne. We're giving Anne the gold star for being the first one to answer here. Supporting the nonprofits we partner with so they are able to carry out their missions. Great. That it's a huge piece when volunteers can make that connective tissue and really represent the community for our organization. Deborah says that identifying unmet needs, forest through the trees principle, absolutely. So volunteers are oftentimes coming from the communities that we're serving. So it can be extremely important to get that volunteer voice to help us look at what does the community need and what does it need now. Rosemary shared helping inspire environmental stewardship. Okay, great. Tamara, hopefully I'm saying that right, or Tamara, expanding our capacity to serve our neighbors through their efforts in our office, in our restores, and on construction sites. All right, sounds like your habitat as they assist us in building homes for those in need. Great, so really getting specific. They're not just delivering programs, they're doing it through all of these different ways. Christine talks about so much talent to get unique projects done, electricians, mechanics, fundraisers. Yes, when you think about the incredible talent that volunteers are bringing our organization. Aria says that volunteers are the heart of our organization. We exist to ensure we match volunteers with their dream volunteer opportunity. Great, and it sounds like that's probably going to, another purpose for that then is helping to meet the community, meet its needs. John says being a friend and mentor for adults living with mental illness. Great. Well, thank you to each of you who share that, because I think that can really shows kind of, like we're looking at a diamond. There's all these different facets to what volunteers can do. And it seems so straightforward, but being very specific about why we're doing this helps us set up our next pieces. Sarah also said vital to the guard, and I will not say that Latin right, Guardian Ad Litem program because they are unbiased. Okay, great, thank you. So that extra outside objective view is huge. So let's keep going on to practice part of the model. So now that we're clear about what it is that what we're hoping to achieve with volunteers, we need to think about what kind of practices do we need to implement so that we go from that dream or vision to a reality. Now, a lot of times we spend most of our conversation in volunteer management around the practices. So I'm not going to give as much attention to this, but I want you to see how it fits within the model overall. So here we are, again, practice. These are the actions taken to realize the volunteer promise. So if we go back to our community garden, let's go back to the garden. It's always a nice place to be. Our purpose here is to not only plant and sustain a garden, but it's to plant and sustain a community, right? So we are trying to get the community involved as ambassadors. And so because we know that, we can think about what kind of practices we need to recruit and to train and to support people overall. So we think about what are the practices we need to actually create this garden. And we might specifically want to recruit maybe a master gardener, but not just any master gardener. We want master gardeners who are jazzed about sharing their knowledge and about getting other people excited for community gardening, right? We might think about a local family who is familiar with growing a particular food that was a staple of their diet. For example, if we are serving a community that has refugees, right? How do we plant and grow and sustain all of these different kinds of vegetables that might be really important to their meals? We can also think about what practices do we need if we're going to support volunteers in being ambassadors for the organization. So sometimes that's as easy as saying, hey, we hope that if you're having a great experience, you'll go out and tell lots of people so that they will come in to be a volunteer, or they'll get a community plot of their very own, or they will come to our farmers market that we're having on the weekend. You might put something in the garden, one of those big picture frames, right, that we do so that people will tag it on social media when they come to the garden to serve or to plant themselves. We might rethink about recruiting from different organizations that we partner with. Who are the formal leaders? Who are the informal leaders in the community? And how might we partner with them so that we're thinking about how do we get this word out that the garden is really a place to come together. So again, we want to be explicit about the purpose of volunteers so we can think about what kinds of practices do we need to put in place to realize that. We also want to think about the values and the practices around equity and inclusion. Excuse me. Because so often for most of our organizations, the volunteer department is in this very powerful nexus of bringing the community into the agency and then the agency connecting in with the community. And so this is one of the places we're gatekeepers. We want to think about, how are we bringing people in? What is their experience? Does everyone who comes in feel welcomed and included? Do we value their opinions, especially whoever had mentioned talking about unmet needs? Are we asking for volunteer feedback? Is our volunteer effort, is that accessible to anyone in the community? And so thinking about these kinds of issues is particularly important. We want to think about, have we designed our volunteerism with input from the community we're serving, right? If we went to our participants, the people we're serving, and said, what would a good volunteer be? They probably have some opinions about that. And that might be very different than the way that we've been thinking about it when we're sitting in our offices or out in the field. So if we are thinking about our practices overall and meeting our purpose, one of those purpose oftentimes is to bring the community in, and we want to make sure we're welcoming to the whole community. So we'll go back to our worksheets. Again, this practice piece is brief because we want to really dig into the proof, but here are a few questions to consider. Do our volunteer engagement practices enable us to realize volunteer promise? And do our volunteer engagement practices align with our organizational mission and values? Are they supporting equity and diversity and belonging? And if not, what changes do we need to help us close the gap? So if you've got your worksheet handy, or even if you don't, this is the prompt from the worksheet. We commit to providing a meaningful volunteer experience that meets organization and participant needs by. And you can think about this overall. Here are all the kinds of practices, or you might want to take a, fine-tooth comb and think specifically about your recruiting or specifically about your training, to think, how are our practices helping us realize that volunteer purpose? I'll give you a moment to do that. And if you have any questions, please feel free. I'm going to check in with the chat as well here. We welcome any questions throughout. Okay, so hopefully I'll give you a chance just to jot down a couple notes. I know not everyone's going to have a chance to do that, so we'll keep going and move on to proof. Oops, let me get my cursor back here to move us forward. So this is where the magic happens. Proof is the evidence of volunteer contributions. How will we know if we have been successful at engaging volunteers? What did the volunteers contribute to the organization? And so I see a note here, a question. So you're saying evaluate your practices? Correct. Yes. So we want to evaluate our practices to see, are our practices actually delivering on our volunteer promise? So thanks for that question. Okay, so now that we're into proof, we're going to think about, what is it that will tell us if we've been successful based on our promise and our practices? The beauty of doing it in this way and taking these extra steps up front is that we can finally connect what our volunteers are doing into what the organization is trying to do. So it's very clear that volunteers are putting us on a path of extending our mission. It's clear that they are putting us on a path of extending our budget when we have grounded their work in the pieces in the earlier part of the model. So the proof should tell us if we're realizing the volunteer promise and advancing the mission. And if we are not, what do we need to do to adjust it? And I think the other piece that's important here in the model is the direction of these arrows, these little guys here. So too often what happens is someone hands us an indicator and says, well, we want to know about your volunteer hours. And then we back into practice and say, okay, well, how would we get more volunteers? And that's how we end up designing our program, is that it's based on somebody feeding us a data point that wasn't necessarily drawn from our mission. So when we do start with our mission, figure out what we're trying to do, that tells us what practices we put in place, and that gives us our proof. that makes it a really powerful direction so that it's connecting all of the integral pieces. So that also helps us shift from the question of how do I just get more volunteers than we had last year to a question of how do we find the volunteers who are going to help us meet our mission? How many volunteers do we need to help us meet our mission? And what kind of volunteers are going to help us meet our mission? We've got a couple pieces here in the chat, so let me just pull those out. So our volunteers stay with us for many years. Would that be proof? Yes, as long as the volunteers are still meeting the mission. I think sometimes, I guess the answer might be, it depends, Rosemary, because volunteer retention can tell us that we're doing a great job with volunteers and people are sticking around and they love the organization and they're doing a great job because of us. We could also think about maybe volunteers who are sticking around, who have become a bit toxic, or maybe aren't welcoming to new volunteers, or volunteers who kind of had their own agenda and are not really supporting and might be sabotaging the mission. So I think it really depends. But again, if you're thinking about that, you will be able to look more closely at who are your long-term volunteers, and then you'll be able to answer that. Thanks. Oh, and I'll go back here because it looks like Jeannie mentioned that they connect with volunteers on a weekly basis to offer strategies, encouragement, results, and gratitude. Great. So that's a great practice to ensure that you're staying in touch with your volunteers and that your volunteers are staying in touch with you. So that there's really a two-way dialogue instead of just being top-down kind of communication. So thanks for sharing that. That's a great practice and a really powerful one for what we're doing. So you can see then as we, oops, let me get back to my screen here. Now, given our conversation so far, we can see that there may be some value if we're trying to figure out what's the volume of volunteers we have. That sometimes gives us some sense. Or if we're doing a grant, having that financial value that to put in as an in-kind donation, that can be really powerful too. But we just want to be careful that we're not only using the proxies of volunteer impact or substituting the word impact for the number of volunteers we have, because unless we're, say, a volunteer center or maybe an RSVP that's all about mobilizing volunteers, most of our organizations don't exist just to have volunteers. We have volunteers to accomplish something else. So we just want to be mindful that these proxies don't get mistaken for the real thing. And the real thing, of course, is messy and beautiful and dynamic and complex. And so what I just want to give us permission to say, yes, this is a really big thing. And if it was easy to do, we'd all be doing it already. If it was even just moderately hard, we'd all be doing it already because you're really thoughtful people and you've been trying to think through this. And so what I want, that brings us to really kind of the next piece that came out from the research was that it's helpful to think about the value in terms of numbers of hours and volunteers, but worth happens to be a much better term. And I picked this up from research about gift economies. So the idea of worth is kind of uses our iceberg here. We can see the stuff above the waterline. That's the value. But worth is the whole iceberg. So it's not just that stuff above the waterline that we talk about a lot. It's the stuff below the waterline. It's what happens as a result of all of those volunteers and all of those volunteer hours. How does that influence and improve our community to have the volunteers engaged? How does it improve our organization? What kinds of connections are made? What kinds of positive change happen because volunteers are involved? So worth is this kind of, it's a much bigger concept that allows us then and gives us permission, I think, to talk about all of the things that matter about volunteers, even if we can't count them. Now, that usually gets, this is the part where somebody goes, well, that's all well and good, Sue, but how do I measure that? And I'd like to suggest that we don't always measure that. There's a lot that happens within volunteerism that can't be measured. It just can't. The best we can do is to be witnesses to it, to tell a story about it. And that's okay because we are a story, a meaning-making species. We tell stories, right? And so what I think is a more potent term for us to use is capture or even reveal. So if we say, how do I capture that? How do I reveal that? What that allows us to do is start moving into the whole iceberg. Oh, I'm so glad that you like that iceberg slide, a couple of you, because I think that's really what we're trying to do here. And again, language matters. So if we say reveal, now we can talk about all the things. If we only say, how do I measure that? That goes, whoop, we can only talk about the things that we can count. And sometimes those aren't the things that matter most. We might also want to think about what we're calling our indicators. So if we call them measures or if we call them metrics, that sets us up to think just about the things we can count. If we say instead that we're collecting data or evidence or information or indicators or key performance indicators, KPIs, that allows us to collect not just quantitative data, but qualitative data as well. And because volunteers are often influencing the quality of our services, that can be really important. So here we go. Another way to think about the way we collect data. A lot of times we've been doing it from the outside in. We take whatever the funder gives us, or we take maybe what our state commission gives us because they were getting it from the Corporation for National Community Service, and then we kind of back our way into it. Whereas what might be helpful to think about is what matters to the participants, right? So we've got, it sounds like we had Habitat. It looks like there was maybe a CASA organization. We've got some conservation folks here. What matters to the people closest to that, to the kids who need a CASA? What matters to the CASAs themselves? What matters to the families who are building with Habitat for Humanity? What about all of those volunteers? What about their loved ones and families? What about the staff? If we start from the inside and think about, well, what matters about the volunteer experience to those folks, that might be very different. Because just for example, I think about when I was in Girl Scouting, I wasn't tallying up the number of hours I spent as a leader, particularly when we went on a 4-day backpacking trip. I was thinking about the look on the girls' faces when we came around the corner and saw this extraordinary waterfall. I was thinking about their families who were seeing the girls grow in confidence and enthusiasm for taking on new things that had been kind of scary before. And if we start thinking about our data from that view, it really shifts us in thinking, oh, we have a lot to capture and reveal that maybe the usual suspects aren't letting us get to. So let's keep going here. And I see that the question, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, Natasha. So let's go to our community garden just while we're on this thought and think about that. So now that we've kind of opened up our view, let's think about the kinds of things that matter to our community garden. The purpose of having volunteers in the garden is, one, to help us grow the garden, maintain it, and sustain it over time. And it's also to grow community ambassadors through it. So what kinds of things can you tell me? Feel free to pop these in the chat. What kind of indicators tell us if we have been successful at those two purposes? Brendan, the garden grows. Yes, indeed. Hopefully there is a garden, right? And so, I mean, one of the things we could do, particularly for a garden, which is such a visual kind of experience, is, take pictures throughout. There's not just a before and an after, but, here's what the garden looks like in May and September and November. Jessica shares other people starting home gardens, more people attending the farmer's market. Yes, so you think about what are those ripple effects of this? Christine mentions volunteers look like the community around it. Great. So the people coming to the garden should be a reflection of the community, whether that's in terms of age, ethnicity, background. Like it could be, if we've got a diverse community, hopefully we have a diverse garden community. John mentions that more people want to help. Yes, so we might look at this might be numbers of volunteers or number of people who want to reserve a plot in the garden. It might also be people saying, well, I just came to, stir the compost, but now they say I want to take on more responsibilities. That's a different way to think about people wanting to help. Anne talks about the garden continues to meet the community's needs. Yes. So it doesn't just become this kind of fancy thing that's, trendy these days. But it's really something, it's a gathering place for the community, and it's, they are able to eat or sell the produce that they produce. Tamara, food grown and distributed. Yes, so we can think about, how many fruits and veggies were going out as a result of this. How many families were able to incorporate fresh food? Maybe if we're in a food desert, this is one of the places that we can do that. Dale says, having the media promote the effort, which will spread the word. Yes. So are we getting attention from this in and beyond the community? Linda talks about the overall better health of the community. Yes. So great examples. And I think what you're doing here is showing how there are all of these different facets to what's happening in our community garden. Some of these things lend themselves to counting. Some of them don't lend themselves to counting at all, and that's okay. We just need to figure out different ways to tell that story, and it probably comes through a story, right? Brene Brown says something to the effect of maybe stories are just data with a soul, right? So how are we maybe talking about one really important story that's happening and then saying, and you know what, that's happening with 40 other people who are having their plot. It's connecting them to the land. It's giving them the dignity of growing their own food. It's really hard to measure dignity, but if that's part of the reason that we exist, then let's make sure we're talking about that. Yes, I love that quote from Brene. So let's keep going here, and we'll think about ways that now we can think about your organization. So if you were thinking about ways to capture proof, what ways are volunteers supporting your organization? How will you know you've been successful at having volunteers there? I'll give you a moment to jot a couple ideas down on your worksheet here. And if you need a little, some ideas to get the juices flowing, here are a couple ideas. Number of services offered or clients served, number of program sites or neighborhoods. What's the quality of the service, right? For when you have a CASA, for example, because a lot of folks are familiar with that, what's the quality that comes from having a volunteer connected to a child over a number of months, or a couple kids, if it's a family? That's really powerful. What kind of quality comes from having someone really looking out for the kids' needs? We know that volunteers may be, if they're running your auction, or maybe it's that volunteers are donating on their own. One organization that was doing a capital campaign, when they started looking at their donor prospects, their highest donor prospects were all current volunteers in the organization. That's not the case for everyone, but it just shows that people who are volunteering may want to support the organization financially as well. So those are a few ideas. Another thing that came from the research was a couple worksheets. So if you look at worksheet number 2, and again, you can check this out later on, especially if you're doing this with a team, but I assembled just a whole list. There's tiny print here, so you can't see that, but there's a lot of different ideas that came from the interviews that I conducted and the literature review that I conducted. Not all of those are a good fit for everyone. Again, it matters based on your mission and your promise and your practices, etc. So you'll have to see that, but that's another way to think about, there's all of these different facets. There's all of these different dimensions. How do we really capture that? So I'm going to scroll back here while you're taking a few notes on your volunteer proof ideas, and please feel free to plug those into the chat. And I'm going to go back to Natasha's question. So any best practices on how to coach long-term volunteers to make sure they are still aligned with the organization's mission? Great question. So I think part of it may just be checking what we're doing here. You could do little mini pieces of this. So let's say you just wanted to do a check-in with your volunteers that have been there a long time. Maybe you're just saying, how are things going for you? You've been with us for 2 years or 5 years or 20 years. Here, our organization you've seen so much change in that time. Here's where we're going now. We'd love to get a sense of how does this feel like it's a fit for you? Here are the things that seem like they're a really good fit. Here maybe are some things that we're seeing a lack of alignment, like if there's a problem. If you just want to sort of do a redirection, you could, say, we're really looking at what is the purpose of our volunteer efforts and strategies in the organization. What does that look like to you? Here are the things that I think. Here are the things that we're coming up with as a team. And what does that look like then to have volunteers support it? So you could just kind of use this as a little mini process, some of the questions and prompts just reframed so that they make sense to the volunteer to talk through as you go. And that might be one way to kind of connect them in so that you're getting they have voice and they get to be a participant, an active participant in this organization they clearly care so much about. And two, that it introduces a conversation that it's great that you've been here for so long, the organization's growing, and we want to make sure that all of the parts are growing. And what does that growth and evolution look like to you? And so that you can have a co-creation instead of just being one, like, you need to get on board, right? That's a whole different kind of conversation. So I think that what are the ways that you can embrace people and invite them into these kinds of conversations? So hopefully that helps a bit, Natasha. Thanks for the question. So I'm going to scroll down here to see some of your proof ideas. And should do a little time check here too. Great. So Dale talks about having volunteers report to us the quality of their volunteer experience, which we can share with potential volunteers. Yes. If you're trying to recruit volunteers and you've got happy volunteers, talk about all the things that make your current volunteers happy. What do they care about? What lights them up and gets them excited? Sarah says that's when a child has help finding their own passion, purpose, and path to be assets to the community. Teen mentors are crucial for foster children. Okay, great. So your volunteers are helping you get your foster kids to one place. How do you know that they've been successful with that? So when the kids are finding their purpose and passion, when the kids talk about, I feel like I've got insight into where I want to go. John says, having our clients tell their story. Yes, there's nothing quite so powerful as someone who's involved in your program talking about what it's meant to them. And a great example of, sometimes all we can do there is witness it, but there are lots of ways to witness. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment here. Linda holds an annual focus group with select volunteers from each department. What a great idea, and a perfect segue too. To bring us into the next one. Tamara says we have proof in the final product, the house, the item sales, etc. But we also ask all our volunteers to complete a survey after their volunteer day or shift. Great. So that's a good example of saying we care not only about what happens as a result of volunteers, but we care about what the experience of the volunteer is too, right? It doesn't really mean a whole lot if we built a house and all of the volunteers left crabby at the end of the day, right? So what is it that we're doing to contribute to the volunteer experience? We might also think about what's the staff experience of that. We rarely ask that, but I'm guessing that almost all of us have seen what happens when staff don't really like working with volunteers. So getting a sense of where the staff are, and again, this is sort of what's the value proposition of volunteers to your program, folks? Those can be really powerful conversations. Looks like we might have a couple Q&A questions as well. So let me see about pulling those up. Okay. Should we have a budget for our volunteer? Yes. And so one of the things that you can do from this whole piece is, now that you have a sense of where you're going to go with your volunteers and how they're going to help meet the mission, then you might think about, so what is it going to take to get us there, right? So those practices, what kind of staffing do you need? And or what kind of volunteer leadership do you need to make your practices into reality? What kind of financial do you need? Do you need computers for them, or do you need access to your intranet for them? What's the recognition look like? So these are all things that can go into a volunteer budget. Sometimes they're spread out across the organization. Sometimes they go into like an HR budget or a program budget or resource development when resources are defined as volunteers and dollars. So yes, most folks have a budget, but it lives in it looks different, and it lives in a lot of different places and organizations. So thanks for that question. And what are some ways to define goals and measures or success for volunteer efforts? So hopefully this is giving you a sense of ways to do that. So if you've got clarity on your purpose as an organization and on what your volunteers are there to do, those probably are defining your goals. And ideally this going around this model has helped you figure out, okay, so what does success look like if we're supporting foster teens or creating let's see, outdoor spaces that are free from invasive species, for example, or are welcoming for recreation and inviting of the community. So ideally, that's going to help you get some ideas there. And that worksheet too will be another way that you can get some ideas. So let's figure out, how would we actually go about collecting these sorts of things? And whoops. So think about, what are the sources of information? How can we find out about what we want to know on our organization? So you already did a lot of great examples already, thanks to the folks that participate in chat. Some of you are having your clients or participants tell the story. Some of you are having volunteers tell the story. Some of you are might be coming from your strategic plan, right? What are the sources for this? So on worksheet number 3, if you've got that handy, and if you don't, you just want to, basically what it says is, let me pull up my worksheet 3. It says, we collect information about volunteer value from. So these are some of the places that you might be collecting information from. Would love to hear from you if you've got other ideas that aren't on this list. Why is the strategic plan on the list? Well, if you are trying to connect in the work of your volunteer department to the work of your organization, the strategic plan is going to give you the language and insight about what the organization is trying to do. So if you're using that same language, it can set you up very nicely to be in alignment there. Any other sources that aren't on this list that you're typically tapping into? Just gonna go over to chat and see if we. Okay, so let's keep going on. Methods. So how are we going to get the information out of those sources? Now, a lot of times we think about sort of formal kinds of things, and a couple of you are actually doing that. So Linda's holding an annual focus group with different volunteers. Some of you have surveys. Some of you have interviews. So we can think about those are kind of formal ways to get information out of people. And those are really useful, but we probably aren't going to do a survey on every single program that we do across our entire organization, right? Or we can do a survey after each volunteer experience, like it sounds like Habitat's doing, but that's probably not going to be, you know, a 30 question kind of thing. It might be 3 to 5 questions to just a little check-in to see, are we on track with how we are supporting volunteers? So I want to suggest not only the kind of things that are formal and can be kind of time consuming, but also the informal, because these can be just as rich and juicy as your formal kinds of methods, but perhaps a little bit easier to check into. So you think about those conversations that are happening before or after your meetings or your Zooms. Oftentimes they can be really great ways to find out what's happening with volunteers or what's helping in that program that engages a lot of volunteers. Sometimes somebody just sends you a little email. Oh my gosh, I had this great experience and wanted to tell you. Or it's the hallway kinds of conversations, or the water cooler kinds of conversations for those of us who are back in the office. Sometimes these things are just as powerful as the more formal kinds of things. So I just want to give you permission to use the information that you're getting in these ways as well. And Tamara mentions that their survey for volunteers has 4 questions, if I'm interpreting that right. Thank you very much. Now, you've got this whole purpose-driven model. You've been doing great work with your volunteers. You're asking them to tell you about what the experience is like. You're asking your participants and your staff. You have this fantastic mountain of data now that you need to do something with, right? Because if we just sit on that, no one else in the organization is going to know how great this is. So let's think about all of the different ways that we can share the content with different folks. And please feel free to share the ways that you're doing this too. Whoops. So you can think about, a lot of times this is landing in our annual report. Some folks are reporting on their volunteer engagement successes at their board meetings. Maybe it's once a year, maybe there's a little chunk in every board report. We can think about kind of the usual suspects, staff meetings as well. So one of the things that's nice is if you use like just a little chunk of like a mission moment or a volunteer mission moment at your staff meetings, it helps keep volunteers on the radar, which I know can be a tricky thing to do. If you're talking about it in your organization newsletter, your volunteer newsletter, you get testimonials or stories, you might want to put those on your website in different places, not just the volunteer page, which can be useful for helping recruit other volunteers, but you might want to talk, a lot of folks have an organizational impact kind of page. And it's not just the number of volunteers you have, it's also what volunteers are contributing to your organizational impact. So you could kind of weave some of those stories in there too. You can be talking about it in grant requests, of course, or if you have, all those community fairs that we used to do when they come back, you can be talking about volunteers at those kinds of things. And if you're using these worksheets, you don't have to use the actual worksheet, but if you've been developing all of this sort of content, this sets you up nicely to create a volunteer philosophy statement too, that says, this is what we believe about volunteers. This is how we support our volunteers. And this is what volunteers mean to the organization. You've got all that information that a lot of people put in a volunteer philosophy statement, which basically makes explicit your beliefs about volunteering in the organization. It can be a really powerful step there. So just make sure to check the chat. Okay, I didn't see any other kinds of reporting things. Oh, here's one from Jessica. In-kind donations aren't always tracked, but I try to track it for when volunteers to include as a beyond the hours impact. Awesome, great example. So even if you can't get all of the information, right? For those of you who might be a volunteer center or RSVP or something, like sometimes it's hard to get this sort of secondary data. Or maybe we just get little bits and pieces of it, like Jessica's mentioning with her in-kind donations. That's okay. Talk about the bits and pieces. I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Let's own what we can and say, you know what, this isn't the whole picture, but I just want to give you a sense of here's what volunteers are doing for our programs, and here are the other ripple effects. They're giving us in-kind donations. They are helping introduce us to other communities. They are bringing in other volunteers. They are helping us get feedback or new participants, or helping us staff those tables at the community fairs. All of these are ripples, and you can talk about the ripple even if you don't have the full picture of it. I just want to give you permission to do that. So that's a lot of information, and it can be kind of overwhelming. So I just want to give you a few guiding principles as we move forward and think about where do we start in all of this, because it can be overwhelming. So you can think about where are the pieces that are in, what's most important to you as we move forward. Just get your arms around, what are we doing now? Is it linked to our mission? And if not, do we need to keep doing it? And if it is, how do we kind of deepen that? Does it align with our practices? Are we reporting out on these kinds of things? Are there other sources besides the people we've been asking to know if we've been successful? Sometimes your volunteers can be your very best allies and assets on this kind of work. Some of them would love to dig into this sort of thing because they're geeky like me. They might like spreadsheets or focus groups or whatever the case may be. You're not on your own to do this, and having a partner up front, whether it's a fellow staff member, whether it's a volunteer, can really help keep things on track. You might also want to think about, now that you've got all this data, you go back to that question on your first worksheet about your audiences and think, well, which audiences might care about which things? My caveat here is that don't just assume that financial people care about the financial things. Give them some context. The other part of my dissertation really proved that it wasn't just executives who cared about the numbers. They also wanted to know, what do those numbers mean? The program folks didn't just care about what was the quality of the service. They wanted to know more about the scope. So just don't make assumptions. Give people, again, that full picture and some context, and then share things on a regular basis. The other one I would say is that don't let all of this stuff be so overwhelming that you don't get started. Just pick a little piece off that seems meaningful and try that out. And then see, did that work? Is that useful? If it's not useful, let it go. That's okay. Try something else. If it is useful, think about what's our next step? How can we build on that? If you do a little something this week, you can do a little something next month, and on and on. And in a year, you'll have done something that's really useful for you. So I just want to give you permission also to right size the work, because I know you had lots on your to-do list before we even came to this session today. So I'll stop a little bit here for questions to check in again. Let me go over to chat to see what might be there, or other ideas that you have for proof. Okay, so I've got a question in the Q&A. I understand volunteer engagement, but I have some staff supervisors who are supposed to be overseeing the volunteers in their department, keeping them informed, but they barely give them the time of day. That falls back on me to keep volunteers feeling engaged and welcome. I just don't have the time to keep this going for several departments. How do I motivate staff and have them see the worth and the need, even though it should be clear? Yes, great question. We could spend a whole session on that. We've just got a few minutes left, but maybe just a couple insights might be to check in and just start this conversation about, what is in it? Can they find anything valuable about having volunteers? Introducing, maybe, are there volunteers in the department who might be that bridge, who can be oversight? Sometimes volunteer leadership of volunteers by other volunteers can be a solution. And feel free, if you've got a brilliant idea, to share in chat, other folks who are on the call here too. I think this really gets, demonstrates, just throwing some numbers out there isn't going to be helpful. So figuring out what does matter to your peers. And then can you connect in your volunteer strategies to what they care about? It's probably not going to be a one-time conversation. It's probably, going to be this ongoing effort. But the other piece is, and not to like do the BCC version on kind of going nuclear, but who are their supervisors, and is there a way to influence those supervisors to say, what, this is what we're going to be about, and we're going to support people here, and getting even one department on board with this, and then having that department talk about what a difference it's made. That way it's not always coming from you. We expect it from you. How do we get their peers to say, what, I was sort of on the fence about this, didn't know, but it's turned out to be a good thing after some bubbles, and geez, our volunteer department was a fantastic resource in helping us through this and figure out how it works. So hopefully that's just a little bit of insight, and thanks for the question, Linda. I appreciate that. So I'm gonna just move us on to giving you a chance to think about what is one action that you want to take, or what's one lesson learned you had that you'd like to hold on to, so that when you get back to your inbox, this doesn't just go away entirely. Or is there somebody you'd like to chat about what you learned, or what you're thinking about, or what you didn't think was a good idea, but you're like, I think there's something there that could be good. And then as we're wrapping up, I'm going to leave you with a quote here from Braiding Sweetgrass, which is one of my very favorite books. And Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer says, it is not more data that we need for a transformation, but more wisdom. And I just think that sums it up so well. Would love to stay in touch and welcome your thoughts on this. If this is interesting to you, you want to kind of stay in touch. The blog that I write often pulls out little pieces of this issue, and so that might be an ongoing resource for you. And always happy to make connections on LinkedIn and other places too. So, all right. So thanks so much for those of you sharing in the chat. Get more testimonials from volunteers to share on social media. Great way to just, taking little bits and pieces and getting those out there. Brendan liked the iceberg image. Great. Michael, we use a volunteer advisory board, a volunteer message board, and biweekly Zoom meetings to allow volunteers to participate in more than just events. Great. That really shows how you integrate volunteers. It's not just staff volunteers, it's us. We're a team. Lashandra, implement a volunteer report in our newsletter. Great. All right, and then I think Javita wanted to finish up, so I will turn that over. Thank you so much for your time and participation. This is one of the best chat conversations I've seen in all of the webinars I've been doing, so great job, Florida.
Wonderful. Sue, this was extraordinary, and if everybody would stay on for just 1 second, I am so excited that we can record this, offer this to you free of charge. Volunteer Florida loves to be able to do things like this. You will get the presentation slides as well as the handout in just a minute. I'm going to be sending that. I will also send some information about the rest of our training series, and then also about Volunteer Connect, a few other things that we want to make sure that you know about. We hope that you register for our newsletters. We've got lots of great grants, a lot of great opportunities for you all as organizations doing great work in our state. So many thanks to you, Sue, for your time, your energy, tremendous insight that I know is going to be invaluable to the field. And we hope to see you all back next Monday for our executive roundtable, the third session in our volunteer engagement leadership series. So you all have a wonderful week. Take care. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.